Before we begin, tell me something quietly, just between us. What time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments below. I always read them. And if you're new here, gently, press subscribe before we start. Now close your eyes and drift with me. If you woke up in a medieval village in the year 1346, before the cock crowed, before the sky turned grey, what would you hear? Nothing modern. No alarm clocks, no hum of electricity, no rustling of traffic, just the sound of your own breath, the creaking of the wooden beams above your head, and maybe, if you're lucky, the wind slipping between the cracks in the wattle and daub walls. You'd likely be sleeping on a straw mattress, not thick, not comfortable, just a pile of flattened rushes mixed with husks and the dust of yesterday's boots. Your body is wrapped in wool, stiff from use, and the air is cold. Cold enough that your breath makes small clouds, cold enough that your fingers feel it first. The floor is dirt. The window, if you even have one, is a small opening covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters. There is no glass, not yet, that's for wealthier homes, and you are not wealthy. You are a peasant. You are one of the 90% of Europe who lived close to the soil, worked with your hands, and did not own the land you stood on. The rooster crows. It doesn't mean the sun is up, only that the sky is turning from ink to slate. The animals begin to stir. The pig grunts in the corner. The hen shifts under her straw. And you, aching, stiff, underfed, begin your day. There is no privacy. The whole family sleeps in the same space. Sometimes 2 or 3 families in one hut. If you're lucky, there's a loft. If not, you share the room with the goats and the geese. They keep it warm, warmer than nothing. You roll off the bedding, stand barefoot on cold earth and reach for your hood, not for fashion but for heat. Your shirt is linen, rough and unwashed. Your tunic is wool. Your hands, even at dawn, already carry the scent of soil, smoke and sweat that will not leave. Your first task is not prayer. It is fire. If the embers are still warm from the night before, you are fortunate. You stir them. Add straw, blow gently. If not, you strike flint to iron and hope for a spark. Fire is not convenience, it is survival. You warm a pot of thin barley porridge, no sugar, maybe salt. If yesterday was kind, maybe a handful of beans. You eat standing. There are no chairs, just stools. And no one lingers, because dawn is when labor begins. You step outside. The air is thick with wood smoke and frost, the smell of manure, the soft, damp weight of the countryside. Your world is no bigger than a few fields, a few cottages, and the manor house that owns them all. You belong to the land, but the land does not belong to you. That is the unspoken truth of medieval life. Your village is small. Maybe 30 families, maybe fewer. 1 dirt road, a single stone church. A priest who speaks Latin you do not understand. A bailiff who collects the Lord's dues. A reeve who keeps the peace. Everyone else is like you, tethered to the seasons, the weather, and the distant decisions of people you will never meet. The fields wait. They are not yours. You plough them, sow them, reap them. But the grain is tithed to the church and taxed to the Lord. You walk the furrows with a wooden hoe, your back already sore. The sun, when it rises, does not warm you. It only reveals how much work remains. If it is spring, you are sowing barley. If it is summer, you are bent low in weeding. If autumn, you are harvesting. If winter, you are chopping wood or mending roofs or feeding the animals. There is no day when you are not working, only Sundays, and even then the work does not stop. It only becomes quieter. You do not own a clock. No one in your village does. Time is measured in the slant of light, the length of shadow, the call of the birds, the aching in your joints. Midday is when the sun is highest and the hunger sharpest. You return home with cold fingers and a leather bottle of ale, not strong, not intoxicating, but safer than water. The midday meal is pottage, whatever vegetables survived the week, boiled until soft. It fills but does not satisfy. After the meal, more labor, repairs, threshing, gathering, feeding, hauling. Your body remembers its tasks, even when your mind drifts. The children play with sticks, mud cakes their hands. They are barefoot, even in the cold. Shoes are too valuable to wear when not walking far. You speak little during the day. There is no time for chatter. Words are saved for dusk, and dusk does come, slowly. The sky turns gold, then grey again. The smoke from every hearth curls upward. You gather at the threshold of your home, knees sore, back sore, belly empty. There is no privacy, no ownership, no escape, but there is rhythm, and in rhythm there is a kind of peace. The same tasks, repeated every day, every season, the same meals, the same tools, the same patch of earth. You do not dream of leaving. That thought does not exist. There is only tonight and tomorrow and the next sowing and the next harvest. But what if it rained too long? What if the seed did not sprout? What if your thatch gave way in the snow? What if the Lord demanded more grain? What if the plague came? These thoughts exist, but they are not spoken, only felt, only carried. And tomorrow, before dawn, you will rise again. Because time in a medieval village is not something that passes. It is something you wake into, live inside, and fall asleep beneath, without ever knowing it by name. If you stayed in that 14th century village long enough to feel the rhythm of the day settle into your bones, you'd find that time, while never exact, was never wasted. It moved slowly, not because the work was easy, but because the day was full and the hours long. Each segment of the day followed a pattern, not by seconds but by necessity. The peasant's day was shaped more by the tools in their hands than the sun in the sky. After the morning tasks, after the fire was stirred, after the thin porridge was swallowed, after the first trip to the fields, you returned again and again to the same actions. In spring, the hoe; in summer, the sickle; in autumn, the flail; in winter, the axe. There was little variation. Each season carried its own burden, and your life adapted to it. But there were breaks, small ones, scattered through the day like dropped seeds. The first came at mid-morning, when the work paused briefly for ale, hand bread. This wasn't a feast, it was more a survival ritual, a slice of rye hard from the hearth, and ale brewed weak enough to drink in gulps. The bread might have been baked 3 days ago. It didn't matter. Hunger turned everything into fuel. You sat on a stump or a stone, never a chair. No one had chairs. There were no forks, no napkins. Just hands and the dust beneath your nails. And if someone passed by, a neighbor, a child, a priest, you nodded. You did not speak. Conversation was effort, and effort was precious. The second pause came at midday, when the sun leaned directly overhead and the animals lay down in the shade. You returned to your dwelling, or perhaps the field-side lean-to if the land was far, and ate again. This was the main meal, a bowl of pottage. Every peasant household kept a pot simmering over the fire, thick with barley, cabbage, onion, maybe a bit of leeks or dried beans if the harvest had been kind. Meat was rare. If you were lucky, a scrap of pork or salted herring. If not, turnips. The broth was bland but hot, and heat was comfort. You ate quickly. The afternoon returned you to labor, but it was slower now. The sun's heat in the summer months pressed against your shoulders like a weight. In colder seasons, your hands cracked in the chill, and the wool did little to stop it. Still, you moved forward, because the field did not harvest itself. The animals did not feed themselves. The roof did not thatch itself. Even play was labor. Children fetched water, gathered kindling, chased chickens. They ran without shoes, but they were hardy. The average child in your village would have helped tend geese by age 5, turned hay by 8, and knew how to trap a rabbit by 10. Schooling was a rare privilege, reserved for boys bound for the clergy. Girls learned from their mothers how to spin wool, how to grind grain, how to tend wounds, and they all learned how to keep silent when the Lord's men rode past. Not out of fear, but out of habit. Every few days there were changes. The visit of a bailiff collecting rent, a messenger on horseback with news from the town, a traveling friar preaching repentance. But these events came and went like weather. They didn't interrupt the harvest. They didn't stop the spinning wheel. If anything, they became part of the landscape, like hills or wind or illness, because illness, too, was always near. In a world without antibiotics, without refrigeration, without hygiene, sickness was a permanent shadow. A fever could last a week, a cough a winter. A child might vanish into stillness overnight, but it was not spoken about the way we speak of disease. It was accepted, like death, not welcome, not ignored, just constant. So the day moved on, and as the light began to tilt, the tasks changed. The animals were brought in, the gates were latched, the tools were wiped and leaned against the wall. The children came back from the stream, the woods, the far end of the field. The fire was stirred again, and dinner, though the word wasn't used, was served. It was the same pot, the same broth, the same bread, the same hands. If there was time and a little energy left, the women spun wool by the firelight. The men mended harnesses. Sometimes in late summer, a song might drift through the village from one hearth to another. Not for performance, just for rhythm. A story might be told, one of saints or wolves, or a merchant who once saw a town with windows of glass. No one had ever seen it, but they listened anyway. Night came slowly. There were no street lamps, no torches, only firelight flickering through gaps in the walls, and the glow of the hearth as it faded to red. There was no evening prayer for most peasants. That belonged to monks. Instead, there was silence and sleep, the same mat of straw, the same tunic, the same ache, and perhaps for a moment a hope, though you wouldn't have called it that the weather would hold, that the harvest would come, that the Lord would not raise the rent. You would never call it hope. You would just call it rest, because tomorrow, before the rooster, the day would begin again. And what was time if not a thing you entered and left, and entered again? By now you've grown used to the rhythm, the dawns and dusks, the rush of spring sowing and the hush of winter silence, the scrape of your hoe through earth, the blisters on your palms, the sting of icy wind on your cheeks before sunup. It's all become normal, tedious, yes, but predictable, until it isn't. Because in the medieval village, disruptions come not with warnings or weather alerts or headlines. They come like a candle suddenly snuffed out. Quiet, absolute. And the first disruption is always the same: rain. Not just a drizzle or a day of grey clouds, but days, weeks of relentless downpour. The kind that turns fields into slop and paths into rivers, the kind that beats against your thatched roof until it caves in, the kind that floods your grain store. It's late summer, and what should be the beginning of harvest is now mud. You try to save what you can. You dig trenches, line sacks with waxy cloth, carry bundles of thatching up and down a ladder until your arms are jelly. But it's no use. The barley rots, the rye collapses, the turnips swell and split in the ground, and you know what comes next. The Lord will still collect his due, so you gather what hasn't spoiled, bundle it in worn cloth, and leave it by the manor door. You do not speak, you do not knock. The steward collects it, counts it, and makes note of what is missing. There is no forgiveness, just debt, and when the stores run low, by the end of winter, your family will eat bread made not with wheat or rye, but acorns and dried peas. You will scrape the bark from trees, mix flour with water and nothing else. You will chew slowly, because chewing makes hunger feel like eating. But hunger, when it stays too long, brings its own shadows. Children cough and stop growing. Elders sleep too long. Your neighbors stop talking about the weather and start talking about death. And then the second disruption arrives, sickness. It doesn't knock. It doesn't. It doesn't ask. It just begins. One child with a fever, a woman with swollen glands, a man with dark patches under his arms. You know these signs. Everyone knows them now. It's not the first time. Sometimes it's ague. Sometimes it's the bloody flux. Sometimes it's just called the pestilence. But this one spreads fast. You try not to panic. You light candles. You say prayers you only half understand. The priest comes to your door, swings a censer, sprinkles holy water. It smells of rot and herbs. It does nothing. You stop going to the fields, not out of fear, but because your legs can no longer carry you. The pigs go unfed. The chickens disappear. The well water tastes of tin. And then the silence comes. At first it's just quieter. Fewer footsteps, fewer greetings on the road. Then the silences get longer. You don't hear the reeves shouting. You don't hear the cartwheels. You don't hear the smith hammering. You wake one morning and realize the silence is total. The village is not empty, but it has emptied, and no one marked the moment it happened. The bodies are buried quickly, or burned, or abandoned, wrapped in blankets and left at the edge of the fields. You're still alive. Somehow, thin as twigs. Weak, but breathing. You chew the last of the acorn bread and drink the ale that tastes more of mold than grain. You stare at the roof above your head and wonder how many others still do the same. Then one morning you walk the lane just to see, and the doors are shut. The windows where they exist are dark. Only the church remains open, not because the priest is there, but because no one dared lock it. Inside it is colder than outside. The incense has long since burned out. The altar cloth is stained. The candles are stubs. You sit, not to pray, but to rest. Your breath echoes, and you wonder, is this what time feels like when it stops? When there's no one to mark the days, no one to stir the embers, no one to bring the pottage to a boil. For a while you wait. You sleep more. You speak less. And then, suddenly, absurdly, there's a knock at your door. A rider. A dusty man with a cowl pulled low. He carries a scroll. His accent is strange. He says he's from another village. He asks your name. Then he asks who else is alive. You cannot answer, because you do not know. A week later, 2 more men arrive. Then a cart. Then someone with tools. And slowly, like sunlight through morning fog, the world returns. Not as it was, never as it was, but enough to begin again. Some children reappear. Some houses are rebuilt. Fields are cleared. The manor sends new men. You are asked to return to the land. You say yes, because what else is there? And so the rhythm restarts. But it is not the same. The fields are quieter. The church echoes more. The grain is stored with extra care. A new prayer is added, one the priest learned from some other priest in some other ruined village. It asks not for bounty, but for survival. You say it quietly, under your breath, because no one wants to tempt fate. And as the seasons turn again, slowly, haltingly, you begin to forget how bad it was. Not out of ignorance, but out of necessity. Because remembering too much makes you stop working. And if you stop working, the field goes empty. And if the field goes empty, the story ends. If you woke up in a monastery in the year 1283, it wouldn't be from a rooster's call or the rattling of a cart. It would be the bell. That sound, deep, slow, round, would echo across the stone walls, filtering through narrow slits in the dormitory. You wouldn't know the time, not exactly, but you would know what was expected. You would rise, not in haste, but with precision. Not because you wanted to, but because obedience was the first virtue. This is the life of a medieval monk, not the life of an adventurer or a warrior or a scholar. Just a man who wakes to bells and lives in hours. They called it ora et labora, pray and work. And that's exactly what you did. But before you could even begin the day, you had to enter the rhythm of the divine office. The bell you heard before dawn was for matins, or in some places nocturnes, the night office. It could be 2 a.m., maybe 3. It wasn't tracked by clock. Clocks were rare, unreliable, expensive. It was time kept by memory and habit. The dormitory was cold. Stone walls, straw mattresses, woolen blankets. You wore the same habit you'd slept in. The floor was rough, the candles were few, and no one spoke. Speech belonged to God. You made your way to the choir, not to sing, not in the way people sing now, but to chant. A low murmur, voices overlapping like the sound of wind through pine. The Psalter, the Book of Psalms, was recited. In full every week. That meant every day you heard and spoke dozens of psalms, whether or not you understood their Latin. You didn't need to understand. You only needed to be present. When matins ended, there was often a short gap. Just enough time to warm your hands at a small fire or sip watered wine. But soon enough another bell rang. Lauds, lauds came just before dawn, marking the first light. It was a praise service. Gratitude for light, for waking, for breath, and when Lauds ended, the day began in full. There was no breakfast in the modern sense, a piece of bread perhaps, water or ale. Monks often fasted through the morning, especially during Lent or other holy seasons. Hunger was not a condition to be solved, it was a practice to be cultivated. Next came prime, around the first hour of daylight. It marked the start of labor. Now, not all monks tilled fields or repaired roofs. It depended on the order. Some were contemplatives, living quietly, devoting themselves to reading, copying manuscripts and prayer. Others, like the Cistercians or Benedictines, emphasized physical work as a spiritual act. You might find yourself in the fields, weeding herbs, tending to bees, repairing walls, or assisting in the scriptorium, where every letter was inked with care. Whatever the task, it was done in silence or with minimal speech. The tongue was considered a dangerous tool. Words could bring pride. Silence brought humility. At terce the third hour work paused. Another prayer. By now the sun was well above the horizon and you were already tired. But that didn't matter. At sext, midday, came another bell and a larger meal. This was the closest you came to what we might call lunch. The refectory, long wooden tables, benches, and high narrow windows, was a place of silent eating. No conversation. Instead, One monk read aloud from a sacred text while the others chewed in thought. Every movement was part of the ritual. After sext, you might rest briefly, then return to work until none, the 9th hour. Another bell, another prayer. By this time, the shadows had begun to stretch. You felt it in your bones. Your legs ached. Your hands were red, but your mind was calm. Routine had a way of softening the edges of suffering. Then came Vespers, evening prayer. The sun slipped low behind the walls. Candles flickered. The chants were slower now, fuller. There was something in the tone of Vespers that felt closer to sleep, even if hours remained. And finally, just before retiring, came Compline, the last service of the day. It was often the quietest, the most intimate. A moment of reflection before darkness. The monks would chant prayers of protection, ask forgiveness for the day's failures, and commit themselves to rest. Then, silence. Not just the absence of noise, but the formal beginning of the great silence, which would last from Compline until after Lord's the next day. You did not speak. You did not wander. You returned to your straw bed, pulled the woolen blanket over your shoulders, and closed your eyes. But you did not sleep easily, because the bells would come again. And you would rise again and again, not because you chose to, but because that was the life. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't even hardship, not in the way that peasants suffered through cold and hunger and rent. It was discipline, time carved into hours, and every hour offered back to God. You might wonder how people lived like this, how they endured monotony, cold, discomfort, lack of choice. But that is to see it from the outside. From inside the monastery, there was peace in repetition. There was clarity in knowing what each hour asked of you. Even boredom became a kind of prayer. The bell didn't ring, not at matins, not at Lord's, not at prime. And in the cloistered world of the abbey, where time was made not by the sun or sand, but by sound, this silence was not simply strange, it was disorienting. You woke, as always, in the chill dark of pre-dawn. But something was wrong. There was no echo from the central tower, no groan of wooden doors, no creak of sandals on stone. Just the soft rasp of wind through the cloister garden. You weren't the only one who stirred. One by one, the other monks shifted in their straw-stuffed pallets. A cough, a whispered muttering, a shuffling of woolen robes. You could feel the unease rising between them. Still, no one spoke aloud. That was the rule. The great silence was to be kept until Lord's. Even if the world had fallen away outside your cloistered walls, your vow was to silence until sunrise, and so you waited. At first you thought it was some kind of test. Perhaps the bell-ringer, Brother Wulfgar, had risen, early to fast in solitude or meditate in the chapel. Perhaps he had chosen as a form of penitence to let the brethren rise by instinct rather than steel. It had happened before, not often, but monks, even holy ones, were still men. You sat up slowly on your narrow pallet. The wool of your habit clung to your skin. You could see your breath in the pale cold of the dormitory. You listened, still nothing. A faint rustle at the other end of the dormitory suggested Brother Aldhelm had stirred. He was older than most, and his joints complained audibly when he moved. You often wondered if he had once been a soldier. There was a deliberate weight to his movements, like a man used to wearing armor. Time passed strangely when you weren't, being told what hour it was. Eventually, just as a faint grey light crept under the high dormitory slit, someone stood, slowly, reverently, and finally, someone broke the silence. Brother Wulfgar has not rung the bell. The voice belonged to Prior Osric. He had risen from his pallet fully dressed, as if he had not slept at all. His face was pale and sunken, but alert. He did not shout, he did not demand, he simply stated the fact. And in a monastery, facts carried the weight of commands. You rose with the others, not in panic, not in a rush. Just steadily. Bare feet padded across cold stones as you followed Prior Osric out of the dormitory, down the eastern stairs, through the passage near the chapter house, and into the northern cloister. The wind was heavier outside, damp. The grass glistened with frost, though no snow had yet come. You crossed to the belfry. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, on the stone floor, still as a reliquary, lay Brother Wulfgar. His eyes were closed, his arms folded across his chest. A small bowl of barley porridge had tipped beside him, its contents dried and cracked. The bell rope hung limply above. He had not cried out. There were no signs of struggle, just stillness and absence. The prior knelt beside him and placed 2 fingers against his throat. He waited, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "We will carry him to the chapel," he said quietly, "and pray." There was no ceremony for this moment. That would come later. Now only silence. 2 monks fetched a stretcher. Others lit candles. You found yourself standing by the great bell. The rope still smelled of sweat and candle wax. It had been Brother Wulfgar's duty for 17 years. He had never missed a service, not once. Now the rhythm was broken. By mid-morning, the monastery was still reeling, not with emotion, for emotion was considered indulgent, but with uncertainty. Without, the bell time had become abstract. You tried to continue your tasks. You carried water from the well. You swept the cloister walk. You mended a torn sleeve in the novices' dormitory, but nothing quite fit. You kept glancing toward the sky, trying to guess the hour. Brother Petrus, who managed the scriptorium, attempted to ring the bell for terce, but it was half an hour late, perhaps more. His hands trembled, the tone was too sharp, the echo wrong. The monks gathered late to chant the psalms, their voices unsure, their pacing uneven. Even scripture felt disjointed. When the divine office falls out of time, the whole monastery stumbles. Meals were missed, a pot of barley scorched. The novice who tended the herb garden forgot to cover the winter rosemary, and frost turned its leaves black. The ora et labora had fractured. It was not that Brother Wulfgar had been beloved, though he was respected. It was that he had been reliable. And in the cloister, reliability was sacred. By evening, the prior gathered everyone in the chapter house. You sat on the cold bench, hands folded, habit heavy. "Brothers," he began softly, "time belongs to God. We mark it only in service." He paused. "Brother, Wulfgar served without fail, and now we must do the same. There is no shame in faltering, but we must return to the hours." He turned to the bell-ringer's stool. "Brother Leofwin," he said, addressing a younger monk who had apprenticed, "under Wulfgar, you will take up the rope." Leofwin's eyes widened. He nodded, swallowed, and stood. There was no ceremony, no blessing, just obedience. That night Compline rang out again, a little too fast, a little too loud, but it rang. The chants were uneven but heartfelt. The candles flickered on the nave's stone arches. The shadows felt softer, and slowly the rhythm returned. Not perfectly, not immediately, but it came. The monks began to move in step again. Prime rang on time. The midday meal returned. The kitchen smoke curled from the chimneys. The scriptorium buzzed with quiet scratching. Psalms flowed more confidently. The garden was pruned, the library dusted. the rules restored. No one forgot Brother Wulfgar, but they did what monks had always done. They remembered by continuing. That was the only way rhythm survived. The bell rang again the next morning. Its tone was slightly off, higher than usual, less round, but it rang. Brother Leifwin, now newly assigned as bell ringer, had pulled the rope with effort. His hands were raw from the friction, but the sound travelled, and that was what mattered. The monastery stirred. Not all at once, but gently, like the slow breathing of a sleeping town. The dormitory was still cold, the straw mattresses still stiff, the stone floors still unyielding. But the order of things had begun to mend itself. Time in a monastery is not a possession. It is a shared act of faith. It isn't measured in seconds or minutes, but in bells and shadows, in the angle of sunlight on a cloister wall, in the length of a prayer, in the heat of the stone beneath your feet. To live in a monastery was to live inside a clock that had no gears, only devotion. For centuries this is how monks lived, without watches, without alarms, without timepieces on wrists or walls. The passage of the day was not a race or a countdown, it was a cycle. It had no beginning and no end. The hours were named not by number but by meaning. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. You didn't just hear them, you inhabited them. But even the most disciplined monastery had its breaks. Moments when routine was cracked, open by weather, illness, or unexpected visitors. On the morning after Brother Wulfgar's passing, it rained. Not a soft rain, but a steady, drenching one that tapped on every tile and pooled in the cloister garden. The wind moaned through the cracks in the refectory wall. Some of the older monks, who still remembered the famine of 1272, looked quietly toward the sky as they chewed their crusts of bread. Rain was a blessing, but too much of it meant rot, collapse, and hunger. Still, the rhythm of the day continued. After prime, Brother Cuthbert was assigned to clean the sacristy. You were sent to the scriptorium. There, in the tall window-lit room lined with wax tablets and ink pots, you sat hunched over a worn copy of Gregory's Pastoral Care. Your task was not to read, but to trace. Carefully, deliberately. Each letter had to be shaped with reverence. 2. Make a single mistake in the text of a saint's wisdom meant scraping the parchment with a blade, erasing with powdered pumice, then redrawing with even greater care. Some monks, like Brother Hugh, claimed to feel the presence of the divine in the curve of the letter G. Others wept while copying Job. But most simply worked in silence, the rhythm of their breath syncing with the movement of their pens. Ink was sacred, so was the parchment. So was the time you spent pressing your hand to the page. The rain did not stop. By sext the air was thick with damp. The kitchen smelled of leeks and turnips boiled with barley. The monks ate quickly. No words were spoken during the meal. Only scripture was read aloud by the appointed lector. As you chewed, your eyes wandered the faces of your brothers. Some were old and bent, with red knuckles and trembling hands. Others were young, faces, smooth and eyes wide, still learning how to hide impatience under obedience. A few were seasoned, neither young nor old, men who had served in silence for decades. None looked toward the clock, because there wasn't one. There was no ticking, no minute hand creeping past, only the bell and the sky, and the feel of your body as it moved from one hour to the next. Later that week, something unusual happened. A merchant arrived at the monastery gate. He brought no spices, no silk, no fine paper. Instead, he brought a gift. It was a small mechanical clock, a rare thing in the year 1283. More a curiosity than a tool. It had no face, no hands, just a set of internal gears and a single bell that rang at preset intervals. He had purchased it in France, he said, a gift from a noble patron whose name was too long to remember. The prior examined it with great caution. It was heavy, made of iron. Its bell sounded thin compared to the deep hum of the monastery's tower, but it worked. It rang every hour, not in response to prayer, but to an unseen mechanism hidden inside the box. A few of the younger monks gathered around, he in awe. Some touched it reverently. One whispered, "It knows the time better than we do." But the older monks were uneasy. Time had always been felt, not measured, experienced, not counted. To hand the authority of the hours over to a machine, it felt wrong. And yet it rang. At terce it rang. At sext it rang. At none it rang. Even when the sky was covered in cloud, even when the wind masked the sound of the tower bell, the small mechanical clock rang its thin note, predictably, unfailingly. Some began to adjust their rhythm to it, others ignored it entirely. The prior did not forbid it, but he did not endorse it. He simply let it exist. A silent test. By the third week, a decision had to be made. Would the monastery let the mechanical clock mark its hours, or would it continue as it always had, guided by human hands and divine rhythm? Brother Leofwin, who had taken up the old bell rope after Wulfgar's death, spoke quietly with the prior. "I do not mind the effort," he said, "but the machine does not sleep. It does not forget. It does not falter." The prior looked at him. "And that is precisely why it cannot be allowed to lead." He gestured toward the bell tower. "When the bell does not ring, we notice. We feel its absence. We ask why. We remember Wulfgar. We repair the rope. We retie the knots. In doing so, we remember our part in time. But if the bell rings and no one knows why, if it rings without our touch, then we are no longer monks." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The mechanical clock was placed on a shelf in the library under a dust cloth. It was not destroyed. It was not condemned. It was simply not trusted to lead. And so the days continued. The monks returned to their rhythm. The hours marked by the pull of a rope, the toll of a bell, the quiet step toward the choir stalls, the scent of beeswax candles in the nave. The monastery endured. Time moved forward, not with precision, but with meaning. Not always perfectly, but always faithfully, and Brother Leofwin kept ringing the bell. The first thing you felt was the ache in your hands, thick, numb, calloused. Then came the scent, acrid smoke, the tang of scorched metal, the sharp sting of ash and sweat. You opened your eyes to find darkness, not the quiet, blank darkness of night, but the dusty, suffocating gloom of a low-beamed room where the only light came from embers in the hearth. You blinked, once, twice. Your eyes stung, your back ached, and in the corner a shape moved. It wasn't a man, it was a furnace, alive, breathing, radiating heat from a wide, gaping mouth rimmed in soot and glowing orange. A blacksmith's forge. You were in a medieval smithy, and it was already morning. You stood slowly. Your legs complained. Every muscle in your arms felt like it had been pulling something heavy, again and again. You looked down. Your fingers were thick, blackened with soot, and stained with something you didn't want to guess. There was no mirror, only a dented basin of water near the wall. You caught a glimpse of yourself. Beard uneven, hair matted, eyes rimmed with ash. Your tunic clung to your ribs. Coarse linen, brownish grey, a hole at the collar, burns near the hem. You were not a, Lord, not a knight, not a merchant, not a monk. You were a blacksmith, and your day had already begun. The first hammer rang before prime, not from your forge, but the one across the square. You weren't the only smith in the village. There were two, one older, one younger. You did shoeing, ploughshares, and the church's hinges. He did nails, hinges, and the finer work, locks, keys, buckles. Between the two of you, the village was held together. By iron and heat and hands, you stepped outside, boots crunching on frost-hardened mud. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon, but the air shimmered faintly with smoke from the nearby hearths. Somewhere a cock crowed, a dog barked. A boy shouted, then went silent. It was life as it always was, except now it was yours. The smith's job was not romantic, it was not heroic, but it was vital. Every door latch, every wagon axle, every cooking spit, scythe, plough, and nail came from a forge like yours, and every one of them had to be made by hand. You walked back inside and opened the shutter, letting in grey morning light. The tools were all there: tongs, punches, hammers of 4 sizes, a leather apron stiff with sweat and soot, and a pair of gloves, fingerless, blackened, patched again and again. You went to the bellows. Not a simple pedal one, but the large kind. Twin bags, mounted high, that you pumped with a long lever. It wheezed like an old animal, and the coals flared red, then white hot. The fire was ready. You weren't, but you worked anyway. The first job of the day, 2 horseshoes for the Reeves mare. She'd cracked one galloping on stone and limped. The rest of the way to market, you'd promised to reforge it. You pulled the iron blank from the pile, shaped like a crescent moon, set it in the coals, watched the edge curl like dried leaves. You waited until the metal turned the color of a dandelion. Not red, not orange, but yellow. Then you moved fast. On the anvil, each strike of the hammer sent sparks outward like insects fleeing the flame. You didn't count blows. You didn't think. In numbers, your body remembered. Your wrist angled naturally, your left hand turned the piece without looking. You flattened the toe, arched the sides, tapped the heel. It sang. Metal always sang. When it didn't, you knew something was wrong. You quenched it in the barrel beside the forge. Steam hissed upward. The smell of iron and smoke filled your nose. You breathed it in, not because it was pleasant, but because it was familiar. Outside, a boy waited, maybe 12, thin arms, straw-blonde hair, barefoot in the frost. He looked nervous. "Di said to come ask about the plough pin," he mumbled. You grunted. "Still in the quench, come back at none." He didn't nod, but he didn't argue. He backed away slowly, as if uncertain whether he'd fulfilled his duty. You returned to your tools. In the medieval world, the blacksmith was both invisible and indispensable. No feast could be cooked without your hooks. No field could be sown without your shares. No knight could ride without your straps. No farmer could reap without your sickles. You were the skeleton under the village's skin. But you were not honored for it. No one bowed to a blacksmith. You were respected, feared even, but never exalted. You lived near the edge of the village, not among the pigs, but not far from them. You worked with fire, after all, and fire meant danger. Fire meant unpredictability, and unpredictability was always watched. Around. Sext, you took your first bite of bread. It was hard, cracked at the edges. You softened it in a cup of beer. There was no meat, only onions and a bit of cheese. You ate quickly, alone, watching the forge. That's how it always was. Sometimes the priest would bring a bent censer for repair. Sometimes the bailiff's son would wander in. looking for a scrap of iron to carve his initials. Sometimes you got news of a caravan, of a royal tax, of a coming frost, but mostly you listened to the fire and the hammer and your own breath. You had no clock. You measured time by the forge, how long it took the iron to heat, how many strikes before it flattened, how quickly the barrel emptied, how the sun moved across your bench. That was your calendar. That was your hourglass. As vespers approached, the sky turned from white to grey. A wind picked up. You shut the shutters and raked the coals. One more piece before dark, a hinge for the church's front door. It had rusted through again. You took a flat bar and heated the centre, curled it with your pliers, formed the loop, drilled the hole with a hand-cranked bit, took an old spike and cut a thread, all of it by hand. The fire hissed behind you. Your shoulders ached, but the hinge was good, better than the last one. You'd sleep easier knowing it wouldn't collapse on some widow in the middle of Mass. By Compline, the forge was dark. The coals glowed faintly. The tongs hung on the wall. The hammer lay across the anvil like a sheathed sword. You stepped outside. The stars had come out. You could see your breath again. Across the square, a candle flickered in the chapel window. Someone prayed. You didn't. You'd said your prayers. With every blow. The next morning you were already awake before the sound of the boy's steps. He knocked lightly on the edge of the smithy doorframe, a sound too soft to disturb a man who slept deeply. But your body had trained itself to rise long before the sun. You opened the door before he knocked twice. "The plough-pin," he said again, trying to sound important this time. You nodded. No greeting, no formality. You weren't a priest. You weren't his father. You were a smith, and work spoke louder than words. You handed him the reformed pin, smoothed, hardened, fitted with a loop at the end so the farmer could thread a leather thong and keep it tied to the yoke. He took it with both hands, like it might burn him. "Da says thank you," he muttered. You nodded again, not because it mattered, but because the pin was good. You had standards, and they were not for sale. After the boy left, you returned to your tools. The morning's task was dull. Nails. Not a dozen, not even 100. The carpenter needed 200 nails for a barn repair. Hand-forged nails, not spun by machines, not rolled from wire. Each. One would be cut from square iron stock, heated, tapered, headed, and cooled. Over and over. You set the fire and got to work. By mid-morning you'd made 50. The muscle memory was solid. Strike, twist, clip, quench. Again. Each nail was slightly different. No two were exactly the same length, shape, or head, but each one held. That was what mattered. A widow came in just before sext. Her voice was thin and her back was curved like a shepherd's crook. Her hand trembled as she held up a broken iron pan handle. "Can you fix it?" she asked. You didn't speak much, but your hands knew the answer. The pan was rough-wrought iron, folded over the rim. The handle had snapped where the rivet had loosened over time. You tapped the edge gently, then brought out the punch, the hammer, the new rod. 15 minutes later, the handle was reaffixed, flattened to the bowl and hammered tight. She smiled. "My husband made that pan." You nodded. That meant you had repaired more than metal. You had preserved memory. You didn't charge her. Not because she asked, but because you knew she wouldn't forget. That was enough. The rest of the day was heat and rhythm. The fire lived and breathed with you. Sometimes when the wind shifted, smoke would curl around your ankles and rise, pressing against your eyes and mouth like a question. Why this life? Why not one with land, or books, or gold? But you didn't answer, because the answer wasn't in words. It was in the weight of the hammer, The curve of the horseshoe, the hiss of water against hot iron. It was in the muscle you didn't know you had, and in the silence no one could steal. Around none, the priest arrived. He didn't enter, just stood at the edge of the threshold, robes greyed by soot in the air. "The sacristy latch is sticking again," he said quietly. You looked up. He didn't expect you to kneel or bow. You were the smith. He needed you. You nodded once, reached for your apron, and walked with him across the square. The church was smaller than most imagined. A single nave, stone walls thick enough to block wind, roof patched with lead and oak. Inside it smelled of wax, wood, and old incense. The sacristy door was warped. The latch had rusted. You didn't comment. You knelt, scraped away the corrosion, tested the bolt, and replaced the pin with a thicker rivet. The priest watched. But he didn't speak. He knew better than to interrupt the only man in the village who worked with fire. When you finished, he pressed a loaf of bread into your palm. "From the tithe," he offered. You accepted it, because you knew it came not from charity, but from necessity. That night the fire died slower than usual. You let the coals linger. The smithy was quiet. Your arms were heavy, your fingers cramped, but your heart was still. You remembered something your father once told you, maybe, in a voice now lost to memory. A good smith doesn't just shape iron, he shapes time. You hadn't understood it then. But now, with your hammer resting on the bench and the bellows finally silent, you did. Every piece of iron told time. A nail measured seconds, a horseshoe measured days, a gate hinge lasted generations. You weren't just making tools, you were anchoring the world, one glowing strike at a time. You were up before dawn again, but something had shifted. The village was still asleep, but the stillness wasn't calm. It was brittle. The kind of stillness that breaks easily. In the darkness, your breath hung like steam above your bedroll. Winter had crept in during the night, pressing against the thin shutters, tightening the air in your lungs. You stirred the ashes of the forge. Cold. Nothing but dust and last night's failure to hold heat. You built it again, slower this time, layering the kindling, gently laying the charcoal over it, blowing into the coals like a shepherd tending to a sick lamb. Eventually, the fire answered. It always did. You stood back, listening, to the early creaks of the village waking, the crows, the distant coughs, the wet sounds of water being poured, the scraping of shoes on frost-crusted dirt. You would not make nails today. You would not fix plow pins or shoe another animal. Today, you were to build something else. The reeve himself came. He was a man of few words and fewer smiles, but his presence meant one thing. Someone important wanted something made. He stood in your doorway, hat in hand. "The manor wants a new lock," he said, "for the storeroom." You didn't need to ask why. There had been whispers. Grain was vanishing. Some said rats, others said boys. You suspected something deeper, but it was not your place to ask. You nodded once. The reeve placed a leather pouch on your bench. Inside, iron stock, 2 small ingots, and a strip of brass. Enough to make a warded lock, nothing too clever, but far more than the village usually trusted on a door. "By Sunday," he said. Then he left. You held the pouch for a long moment. A lock. That meant filing. That meant tensioning. That meant cutting precise grooves and matching tumblers. You wouldn't be using your hammer much today. Instead, you would need your mind and your patience. By mid-morning, the fire was barely touched. You sat at your bench with file in hand, turning a cold ring of metal over and over. Each stroke had to be precise. If the groove was too shallow, the key wouldn't turn. If too deep, the mechanism would jam. You had no modern files, no electric tools, no precision instruments, just a small steel rasp, your hands, and light from a single shuttered window. You'd made locks before, but only 3. The last one had been for the priest's alms box. Before that, for a traveling merchant who wanted a chest lock. This one would be the most complex. You filed for hours, then tested, filed again, then rechecked. Brass filings stuck to your fingertips. Iron dust gathered in your beard. You didn't speak, didn't eat, didn't move much. The forge behind you hissed softly, waiting. But you were shaping something else now. Not heat, not weight, but silence. The sun had begun to set when you tested the key. You turned it slowly. Once, twice, it caught. You adjusted the pressure, filed a notch, tried again. It clicked, then turned, then opened. You exhaled. Not with joy, but with satisfaction. Locks were strange things. They didn't protect with force. They protected with delay, with frustration, with the hope that whoever wanted in would give up before they succeeded. This one would hold. You wrapped it in cloth and set it on the bench. The reeve would return at sunrise. That night you didn't sleep immediately. Instead you sat outside, watching the stars between the gaps in the thatched roof. Your hands were stained with soot and brass. Your breath came slower now. Each night blurred into the last. Time wasn't measured here by calendars or numbers. It was measured by projects. The pot handle, the broken sickle, the door latch, now the lock, and soon something else. You wondered, sometimes, what life would have been like had you woken up elsewhere, as a monk, as a merchant, as a miller or reeve or soldier, but none of them made sense to your hands. These hands were not for holding books or trimming parchment. They were not soft enough to count coin or weigh wool. They were not quick enough to pull bowstrings or aim lances. They were for gripping hammers, for balancing blades on anvils, for pushing the edge of hot iron with nothing but instinct and heat behind your bones. This life made sense, even if no one praised it. On Sunday, the reeve returned. He didn't test the lock. He simply took it, nodded, and handed you a round loaf and half a wedge of cheese. The cheese was hard. The bread was crusted, but the payment meant respect. Not gold, not words, just food. In the medieval world, that was all a man like you needed. That afternoon, a boy from the far edge of the village came running. His leg was bleeding. His voice shook. "There's been a fire," he cried. "The cooper's shop." You didn't hesitate. You grabbed your bucket and ran. The cooper's shop was just behind the alehouse, near the stream. His forge had been smaller than yours, meant only for heating metal bands for barrels. But the straw roof had caught, and now smoke rolled upward in sheets. Villagers formed a line to the stream. You joined them, passed buckets, shouted warnings, shoved burning timbers aside. By nightfall, the fire was out. The cooper stood in front of a blackened frame, silent. He'd lost his tools, his bench, his stock, everything except his hands. You approached him slowly, then handed him your extra hammer. He looked at it for a long time. "Yours?" You nodded. "No one else got a spare?" You said nothing, then turned and walked home. It was a small thing, a hammer, but for a craftsman it was everything. You knew he would return it eventually, and if not, you'd make another. Because that was what you did. You shaped what had been broken, not just metal but meaning. Days passed. The lock was never mentioned again, but you heard it click every time you passed the manor. The sound meant safety. It meant someone still trusted your craft, even if they never said it aloud. You kept the fire going longer now, not because you needed it, but because it was yours. The forge was your companion, your clock, your church. It gave you rhythm. It gave you work. It gave you silence. In a world where few things lasted, your work did, even if no one remembered your name. It begins with cold fingers, no ringing bells, no grand revelations, just the raw sting of icy water pressed against your hands. You wake in a low timbered room, its roof sagging in the middle, its walls heavy with damp. There is no bed, only straw, no sheets, only wool. The air smells of soot, soapwort, and wet linen. You are a washerwoman now, not a wealthy mistress with keys on her hip, not a nun, not a weaver with a loom. You are one of the invisible ones. You wash the linens of others. You scrub the woolen underthings of men who have never spoken your name. You scrape the stains from the shifts of children who never see your face. You boil, you beat, you hang, you rinse, and you do it all before the church bell tolls prime. This is your life now, and the day begins before the sun. You stand barefoot in a stone-floored laundry yard behind a priory. The nuns have not yet stirred, but the servants have. You are one of 3 women tasked with the linens, one young, one old, one silent. That's you, the silent one. No one recalls when you arrived, not even you. Your hands are red, cracked, and permanently creased. Your sleeves are soaked past the elbow. Your back aches in a way that doesn't go away even with rest. You've forgotten what it feels like to sit without pain. A copper pot boils over an open fire near the wall, fed with sticks and bark and old cloth. The woman beside you stirs it with a stick as tall as her shoulder. Inside, the pale ghosts. Crève undergarments churn in the froth, mixing with ash and crushed fern. Soap, as you knew it, doesn't exist here. No bars, no perfumed brands. Here, soap is lie and heat and patience. It's made from wood ash and animal fat, from boiled herbs and urine. The liquid is slippery and caustic, and it can burn the skin if you stir too long, but it cleans, and that's what matters. You move to the tubs. There are 4 of them, carved, from wood, darkened by years of use. The first is cold soak, the second is hot rinse, the third is scrub with stone or knotted stick, the fourth is clear rinse, though never truly clear. Today's work is a pile of habits, undershifts, children's, linens and altar cloths. Most are plain. A few are delicate, all are dirty. You sort them without thinking, coarse to the side, embroidered to the bench, blood-stained to the fire. Some stains require boiling, some require vinegar, some require the edge of a knife. You do not speak as you work. Your mouth is cracked from cold and your voice holds no power here. The old woman, her name is Myrta, mutters prayers under her breath as she scrubs. Not because she's pious, but because it keeps her warm. The young one, Ansa, grumbles about her hands, her nails, her knees. She dreams of working in the kitchens where it's warm. But you only scrub. You scrub because it is morning, and because morning must be endured. By tierce your back is soaked through, but the frost has not lifted. Your hands are raw. One of your nails has split. You dip a cloth in vinegar and wrap it. No one notices, not even you. In the corner of the yard, there's a stone slab known as the beating block. It is older than the priory. No one remembers who carved it. It is flat, sloped slightly and smoothed by centuries of cloth being slapped against it. You place a heavy sheet across it, raise your paddle and bring it down. The sound is sharp, satisfying. You beat the cloth not out of anger, but because the fibers must be softened. Linen grows stiff when soaked. It must be beaten to loosen. The rhythm is familiar. 1, 2, flip, 1, 1, 2, flip. It echoes in your spine, travels into your jaw. You could do it in your sleep. Perhaps you already are. The cook's assistant arrives around midday. He brings a sack of rags and a smile far too cheerful for this cold hour. "Got more for you," he says. Myrta growls. Answer sighs. You say nothing. He lingers a little too long, watching, perhaps waiting for someone to flirt. But washerwomen do not flirt. Their hands are broken, their backs bent. They do not carry perfume or promise, only steam and silence. You sort through the new rags. Among them you find something strange, a strip of fine cloth, green-dyed, likely silk, torn along one edge, blood on the other. You say nothing, but you soak it in vinegar and scrub it gently over and over. Silk was not meant for the laundry, certainly not this kind. You wonder for a moment whose secret you've just erased. When the bell tolls, none. You hang the last of the sheets. The line sags under their weight. The wind picks up. It is not warm, but the cloth dances slightly, and the steam of drying water curls like incense. You pause to watch. Just for a moment, Myrta nods off on her stool. Answer has gone to beg the cook for bones to boil. The yard is quiet. You reach into your apron and pull out the sliver of silk you tucked away. You don't know why. You just want to hold it. It feels like a story no one will tell because your life is not made of stories. It is made of stains and stones. You think briefly about time, how it flows here, not in hours or watches, but in cloth. When the altar linens are washed, it's Sunday. When the children's rags arrive in heaps, it's plague season. When the nuns send out sheets in silence, it's after a death. And when nothing arrives, that's the quietest day, but never the best. Because if no one sends linens, it means no one remains to wear them. You do not measure your life in years. You measure it in buckets, and in how many times you've watched steam rise from the boiling pot before dawn. It is the third day of rain, the kind of rain that doesn't fall in sheets but in steady, soundless needles. It doesn't flood or roar, it just seeps into your boots, your bones, your breath. You no longer bother keeping the laundry dry. You've set up lines beneath the eaves, rigged whatever dry cloth remains as makeshift roofs. But it doesn't matter. The air itself is wet. Damp settles into everything. Myrta grumbles about mildew. Answer weeps when she thinks no one can hear. You say nothing, you wash because someone must. There's something you've learned here. The water knows everything. It remembers every illness, every insult, every spill. Every wound opened and rinsed. Every sin pressed into sheets. The blood of a birthing mother. The sweat of a dying monk. The sickness that settled in a child's nightgown and would not leave. These things are not forgotten. They are washed over and over until the cloth no longer protests. The priory's rules forbid conversation in the early hours, but rules dissolve in steam. Myrta has taken to telling stories again. Not loud ones, just small mutterings. Between scrubbing and rinsing. There was a girl here once, she says, wringing out a habit. Ran away with a peddler. Left her linen behind. We washed it anyway. They buried it later. Like she'd died. You nod. Because you've seen that happen. Not just here, but again and again. Names vanish. Cloth remains. And the washerwomen, they remember. Not with faces, but with stains. The cloth doesn't lie. Take the thick woolen tunic Answer pulls from the pile today. It's from a guest staying at the priory, a scribe travelling from York. You can tell from the ink along the hem, from the wear in the right elbow, from the faint tang of sweat and beeswax. He is left-handed. He sits long hours. He works in silence. You've Never met him, but you know him better than most by the time you're wringing out the sleeves. You can picture the way he hunches. You imagine he's tired, but not unkind. You set his tunic out to dry beneath a sheltering ledge, not because anyone told you to, just because it felt right. Mid-morning, the nuns bring down a bundle in a basket. It's different from the usual laundry, cleaner, wrapped in linen. No note, no explanation, just a look. You take it without comment. When you unwrap it, you find an old altar cloth. Gold-threaded, now fraying, stained along the bottom. Wax, mostly, maybe oil. A few dark spots that might be blood, though it's hard to say. It's not for laundry, it's for remembrance. You boil a separate pot, you mix the soapwork more gently this time, and you scrub not with the stone, but with cloth, as if asking the fabric for permission before every touch. You do not ask why it was brought. You do not wonder what ceremony ended for it to be retired. You only wash, because that is your job and your burden. Later that day, Hyansa cuts her hand on a broken wash paddle. The gash is small but deep. She cries. Myrta grunts and wraps it in old linen, muttering about infections and ghosts. You say nothing. But in the evening, when Ansa's gone to rest, you leave a bundle of dried yarrow and marigold at her sleeping mat. She won't ask who did it, and you won't answer. That's the way it works here. Nothing is said, but everything is done. You dream. That night of clean water, not buckets, not tubs, but a river, wide, silent silver. You're kneeling at the edge, washing a single sheet that stretches farther than you can see. It never wrinkles. It never stains. You wash it not because it's dirty, but because it needs to remember what it feels like to be touched. You wake with tears on your cheek, but you don't tell anyone, because dreams are private, and washerwomen don't dream, at least not aloud. The next morning, the scribe comes to collect. His tunic. He doesn't speak, just nods once, but he notices the hem, how the ink stain has lightened, how the thread is unpicked from where the seam had come undone. He hesitates, then places a small coin on the bench. Silver. Not much, but far more than a washerwoman ever expects. You don't touch it until he leaves. Then you place it, quietly, in the clay pot near the fire. That's where Myrta keeps the emergency soap money, used only in plague or death. The coin clinks against the others, just 3, but now 4. It's a fortune, in its way, and also a secret. As you rinse the last of the day's cloths, Myrta speaks again. You ever think of leaving? You don't answer. She continues anyway. I did. Once. Long ago. Thought I'd walk to the coast. Find a boat. See. Where it went. She laughs, a dry, crackling sound. But where would I go, eh? I'm not a wife, not a nun, not even a beggar, just these hands. She holds them out. Red, swollen, permanent. You look at yours and nod. By sunset, the rain has stopped. The air smells different, like green wood and ash. You hang the last tunic and watch it flutter in the wind. You think for the first time of what it would be like to not be here, to wake again somewhere else as someone else, a trader, a cook, a falconer. But each time the image fades, because you don't know those lives. You only know this one. The weight of wet cloth, the crack of paddle on stone, the silence that comes after the steam fades. You think about the altar cloth again, how gently it yielded, how, even frayed, it held its shape. It was more than cloth, it was memory, and so are you. You are memory, living and silent, washed and folded and waiting, not for praise, but for the next stain, the next spill, the next whisper of water. The day begins unusually quiet. No rain, no snow, no crows on the roof, just stillness and cold, the kind that pinches your fingertips and makes the breath in your nose sting. You awaken before the bell, your body tuned to the rhythm of repetition. It doesn't wait for bells anymore, or light. The courtyard where the laundry tubs stand is empty for now. The frost on the wooden planks hasn't melted, and the stone basin is sealed with a thin skin of ice. Even the fire pit seems reluctant to catch. It is All Souls' Day, and the air feels heavy with something unsaid. By sunrise, Myrta arrives, slower than usual, one hand pressed to her lower back, her breath loud in the still air. You help her set up the lines in silence. She doesn't speak much now, not since her coughing started. Answer does not come, not at prime, not at tierce, not by midday. There is talk she's been sent to the infirmary, a fever, maybe worse. Someone says her eyes rolled back. Someone else says she touched a stranger's laundry without gloves, but no one says her name with any certainty. Not here, not in the laundry yard. The washerwomen aren't remembered until their work goes unfinished. You carry the day's load alone. Myrta can only do the folding. You wash, and then, around none, you find it. The cloth that changes everything. It's a large one. Coarse linen, brown stitched, heavy with water. Before you even soak it, and thick with stains that you know too well. Blood, lots of it, old blood, but also new blood. Sticky, dark, layered. You run your fingers across it slowly. The cloth is stiff in places, shredded in others. You look closer and realize this is not a tunic, not a tablecloth, not a habit. It's a shroud, or it once was. The silence around you grows louder. Myrta sees you holding it and says nothing. She only nods once toward the small tub by the fire, the one kept for urgent items. Sacred items. Secret items. You place the cloth inside, boil the water, add soapwort, charcoal, vinegar, let it soak. You do not stir, you do not scrub, you just wait, and the steam rises like incense. Time passes strangely when you wait for stains to lift. The water goes from pale yellow to deep red. You do not speak, but your thoughts churn louder than the bubbles in the pot. Who did this belong to? Why is it here? And why now? There are rumors of a prisoner brought in secret to the priory cells, of a heretic caught with a stolen relic, of a nun who gave birth and disappeared, but those are always just whispers. Laundry doesn't ask questions. It only receives answers in blood and bile. And even then, not the whole story. By Vespers, the cloth is lighter, still stained, but changed. You wring it out, gently, lay it across the beating stone, but you do not strike it. Not today. You smooth it with your hands, like closing someone's eyes, and hang it beneath the bell tower, out of sight where no one will see. That night, Myrta doesn't eat. She sits on her stool beside the coals and hums something tuneless. You eat your broth in silence, but when you lie down on your straw mat, you see her watching you, and she says, soft as smoke, "I dreamed of my sister last night, first time in 40 years. She died young, got sick after scrubbing a bishop's linens. I always said it was the lie." You wait, and she adds, "Sometimes I think these cloths remember more than we do." Then she turns away and coughs. The next morning she doesn't wake. You try not to panic. You shake her shoulder once, twice. But she is still. Cold, folded like the linen she once handled. The other servants come. They cover her with a cloth you washed just 3 days ago. They carry her away without ceremony. No one cries, not aloud. But when you return to the courtyard, you find her apron still hanging. You take it, not for yourself, but because no one else will. You fold it, smooth it, and place it in the pot near the wall. With the soap money, you work alone now. The tubs seem heavier, the water less warm, but the stains still come. Every day, without fail. A week later, Ansa returns, thinner, docked, pale, quieter. She does not complain about her knees or her nails. She just begins scrubbing, without a word. You pass her the soap. She nods, and together you rinse, the sound of water and stone, the only sound that matters. Seasons. Past the linen changes, more plague linens, more shrouds, fewer bright cloths, fewer visitors. One day, the priory's bell tolls too many times in 1 hour. You know what it means. The fever is inside the walls now. You are told to boil every cloth twice, to use more vinegar, to wear gloves if you can find them. You cannot, so you do what you've always done. You use your hands, your cracked, red, broken hands, because if the stains don't lift, who will remember the names? You write no names, you keep no books, but you know who lived and who bled and what they left behind, and in some quiet, forgotten way, that is history too, not written in ink, but soaked into fabric, washed away, but never truly gone. One morning, you find yourself at the beating block, holding a cloth you cannot remember collecting. It is white, soft, untouched, as if waiting. You raise the paddle, then lower it, then stop, because for the first time you wonder, if no one ever sees this cloth again, did it ever matter that you cleaned it, that you were here, that your hands, broken and forgotten, made something clean again, if only for a day? You look at your hands and realize they remember everything, even if the world forgets. You wake with a start, not from noise, but from the absence of it. The bells haven't rung yet, and the village still sleeps under a veil of cold dawn mist. But something in your body knows it is time. You lift your head from the mat of hay that's supposed to be your bed. The barn above you groans faintly as wind curls through its beams. Somewhere below a horse shifts, snorts, and settles. It is still dark. Not just early, fully dark, but the routine waits for no sun. You are not a son of the manor or of the monastery. You are a stable boy, and you are already late. There's a rhythm to this life, one that beats beneath the bells and beyond the prayers. It begins with hay, always the hay, not fresh, not anymore. It smells faintly of ammonia and damp. You know which piles have been recently turned and which ones hold the beginnings of mold. You know the weight of a forkful by instinct. You know when the bales are too tight and when the mice have started, chewing through the bindings. Before light, you carry armfuls of it down the ladder, careful not to disturb the cat that sleeps at the top rung. The barn cats are sacred, not because anyone says so, but because they are the only ones who keep the grain rats from taking over. The horses know you're coming. They huff and stamp, not out of fear or impatience, but because they know the sound of your feet. You've never thought about that before, but today it strikes you as odd, comforting. You are the only person they see before dawn. You are the keeper of their morning. The water trough is half frozen. You break the crust with the back of a rusted pail. Your hands sting as the ice cracks. You tip the bucket slowly, the slosh of water loud in the hush of morning. The horses drink one by one. You've learned their order. The dappled gelding with the cloudy eye always drinks first. The young colt who kicks the boards will wait. He fears the ice. There is one, old and thin, who drinks last and slowest, as if every swallow must be negotiated. With memory, you watch him, not because anyone told you to, but because you've seen too many animals pass without anyone noticing, and you don't want him to be one of them. By the time the sun pushes through the fog, the carts are creaking in. Grain to be loaded, slop to be hauled. A piglet squeals from somewhere behind the sheds and someone curses in Flemish. You don't look. You have your own work. The stalls must be mucked, straw turned, harnesses checked, and hooves, always the hooves. You know which ones are cracked, which need salve, which are prone to stones. You are not a farrier, but no one else cares enough to remember which animal limped last week, so you remember. Not because it's your duty, but because someone should. Your hands are never clean. Even after scrubbing, they carry the scent of horse and leather and sweat. Under your nails always, bits of hay, blackened soil, hoof dirt you used to mind, now you hardly notice. Your shirt is mended poorly in 3 places. Your belt isn't yours. It once belonged to a man who died 2 winters ago, and whose clothes were divided silently. You are not paid, but you are fed a hard crust. A bit of cheese. Some days turnip, it is enough, at least most days. You don't know your exact age. Somewhere between boy and man. The priest once guessed you were 13. That was 2 winters ago. You think you might be 15 now. Maybe. But who counts when no one remembers the day you were born? There is a rhythm to pain here. You pull a muscle no one sees. You slice your palm, wrap it in rag. You fall from a beam, shake the stars from your head, and return to lifting buckets. You watch the squires ride past with laughter, the manor, boys testing their strength with games. None know your name, but they know when the tack is wrong. They know when their stirrups aren't set. They yell for the stable boy, and you go, because you know their horses better than they ever will. At midday, you eat by the wall, always the same place. A low stone ledge where the sun hits for just a few minutes before it shifts behind the bell tower. You chew slowly, bread hard enough to crack a tooth if you're careless. Cheese gone sour on one edge, a beet this time. Dirt still clinging to the ridges. You don't care, you eat and you listen. To the distant clatter of pots, to the crows on the roof, to the quiet breath of the world working around you. A friar passes with a mule and asks you in Latin if this is the right path to the granary. You nod. He asks again, louder, slower. You nod again. He clicks his tongue in frustration and moves on. You do not speak Latin, but you know where the granary is. You wonder why that is never enough. Later, a knight arrives from the next manor. His horse is foam-flecked, hooves trembling from the ride. The knight throws the reins to you like he's tossing away a rope. Walk him. Water only after 2 hours. He ran hard. You already know that. The animal is half lame. You take him to the quieter pen. Brush his coat gently. Whisper nonsense as you move along the flanks. You know he needs to calm before he'll drink. You know he's not angry, just frightened. Not every rider notices. You do, because you have to. By dusk, the barns are quieter. The hay is back in place, the harness is hung, the floors swept. You check the stalls again, one by one. Not because it's required, because it's right. You climb the ladder back to the loft. Same creak, same dust, same low rafter. That always knocks your shoulder. You lie back into the hay, the cat curls near your feet. Somewhere below, a horse snorts in its sleep. You close your eyes, not because you are done, but because there is nothing else to do until morning, and morning always comes. The days blend. They always do. There is no festival for a stable boy, no saint's day when your hands can rest. The only feast you receive is if a cook accidentally drops something larger than a turnip. You do not complain, because complaining changes nothing. And besides, horses do not care for complaints. They care for timing, and touch, and the quiet sort of presence that doesn't demand anything. That's why you're always up first, always moving before the priest chants matins, before the bells toll prime. Before the fog has even left the ridges of the paddocks, you're already halfway through, scraping out the stalls. There are 12 horses now. You remember when there were 6. That was before the war in the next village. Before the knights came riding through, saying words like levy and vassal and banner, words you didn't understand but learned to fear, and with them came more horses, bigger, heavier, meaner, trained for battles you'll never see. But you care. For them all the same. One of them, the black stallion with the chipped ear, bites. He doesn't mean to, it's habit. Trauma, maybe. You learned it the hard way. He took a piece of your sleeve once. Another time a bit of your skin. Now when you enter his stall you keep your eyes down, body sideways and your voice low. He respects the routine, so do you. That's the rule of this place. Nothing gets tamed, just managed. There's a girl from the kitchen, Lisette. You don't speak to her, not really. But she walks past the barn sometimes, carries a basket of greens or a bucket of slop. She always glances at you sideways. Not boldly. You catch her eyes once while you're carrying a saddle twice your size. She looks away. You feel noticed, but not enough to matter. Still, that night you remember to wash your face and scrub behind your ears. A new stable hand arrives. Boy from the next manor sent as punishment for stealing bread. His name is John. He's older, stronger, but not quieter. He speaks too much. He calls the horses beasts and spits near their troughs. You don't like him. He mocks your silence, says, "You're dumb or slow," but one night he tries to saddle the grey mare too fast, tightens the girth without warning. She rears, kicks him, breaks his ribs. He screams. The steward blames the horse. John is sent to the infirmary. He never returns. You say nothing. You stroke the mare's nose gently that evening. Tell her she did nothing wrong. There's a fire one night, not in the barn, but close, one of the grain sheds. You're awake before the bells, not from noise, but from heat. You grab buckets, your feet bare on frozen soil. You run. You throw water. Not enough to stop anything, but maybe enough to slow it. When it's over, the grain's gone. But the barn is untouched and your arms burn for days. No one thanks you. But the old knight nods once the next morning, and you find an extra crust of bread in your bowl that evening. You don't ask who left it. You learn to read. Hoofprints like signatures, each one unique. Deep, shallow, wide, narrow. The dappled gelding always drags his back right slightly. The chestnut mare sets her left fore wide. You could follow any one of them in mud without guessing. One day, the steward loses a saddle. He accuses the tanner's son. You find the prints behind the chapel. Hoofprints you know don't belong to the tanner. You follow them. Find the saddle buried behind the hedge. The steward doesn't thank you, but the tanner's son nods as he passes you the next day. That's enough. One of the horses dies in the night. The old one. The one who drank slow and breathed like the wind was always too heavy. You find him before dawn, still, eyes open, body already stiff. You sit beside him for an hour before telling anyone, not because you don't care, but because you do. When the others come, they mutter about cost and feed and burial. You don't speak. You walk to the back of the barn, find the small coin you buried months ago, one you found beneath the floorboards and saved. You place it beneath his water pail, not because he needed money, but because you needed to give him something, anything, to say he mattered. Lisette starts leaving scraps behind the barn door. Not many, just a small bit of turnip, or the end of a loaf. Once, half an apple. You never see her leave them, but you know it's her. No one else would think to peel the skin before leaving it. One evening, She passes you on her way to the kitchen yard. She says nothing, but drops a folded scrap of fabric in your hand. You open it later. A handkerchief embroidered with your initials. Crude, but careful. You didn't know anyone knew your name. You press the cloth to your face that night and do not cry. But something inside you softens, like damp straw under a warm beam. One morning, the knight doesn't return. The one with the grey beard and red cloak. His horse waits for 3 days. You feed it, brush it, walk it to the edge of the fields. The steward says he died in a skirmish. The horse doesn't know. It watches the gate each dawn, until one morning it stops and lowers its head. You lead it to the back field, let it roam for the day. You say nothing, but when you look up, you realize you've become the only one who tends the older horses. No one assigned it. You just did it, because someone should. Then, one morning, there's a new horse, tall, pale, restless. You recognize the breed. Frisian. Expensive. Its hooves are too clean, its coat too well oiled. This one belongs to someone powerful, a rider you haven't met yet, but will soon. You sense it. That evening, the steward calls your name, the real one, not boy, not you. He says a knight is arriving tomorrow, wants someone to ride with him on campaign. They need a second hand to manage the horses. They chose you, not because you're the strongest, not because you asked, but because the horses obey you, because none have limped under your care, because silence is sometimes the loudest recommendation. You nod. That night, you don't sleep, not out of fear, not entirely, but because you wonder. You rise before the sky changes color. The air is heavy with mist, and the lantern's flicker barely reaches the rafters. The hayloft, where you've spent more nights than you can count, still smells of old straw and mouse droppings. You don't bother folding the blanket. No one else sleeps here, and the horses below stir as if they know what today brings. A night is coming. You have prepared the new Frisian, checked its hooves twice, braided its mane loosely so the reins won't tangle. The saddle was polished until your arms ached. You even waxed the girth strap, not because anyone told you to, but because it felt necessary, like the silent rituals of prayer or lighting a candle. You don't know the knight's name, only that he's from the north. That he fought in 2 campaigns and returned with fewer men than he left with, that he likes his stirrups high and his wine dark. That's enough for now. When he arrives, he says little, just a look, a nod, and a gesture toward the saddle. You help him mount. He doesn't thank you, but the horse moves like a feather beneath him, and that is thanks enough. The steward watches closely. The knight says, "This one comes with me. Your heart does not race. You do not smile. But later, when you muck the last stall, your pitchfork moves lighter than usual. The road is long, longer than you imagined, longer than you feared. The knight rides ahead. You ride a pack horse behind him. Another servant rides beside you, older but slower. You speak little, which suits him fine. The trees thin by the second day, and the wind turns dry. You sleep on moss. You wake to the sound of owl calls. You tighten saddles. Rub down flanks, cook oats into paste. No one teaches you. You just do it because someone must. At the 3rd camp, the knight's mount limps. You notice before anyone else. You feel it in the stride. Hear it in the breath. You tell the steward. He ignores you. You tell the knight. He stares at you like a wolf measuring silence, then says, "Show me." You do. You lift the hoof, brush back the hair, show the bruise, the small crack. He grunts. "You're good," he says simply. Later he gives, You a new blanket, not as payment, as acknowledgement. The army is a moving city. Tents ripple like cloth mountains. Fires flicker against black skies. There are more horses here than you've ever seen. War horses, palfreys, mules, donkeys, even broken mares carted behind wagons. You don't belong. Not really. But the horses let you in. They remember your scent, your calm hands, your habit of standing still just long enough to earn trust. Soon other knights send for you to check a loose shoe. To calm a bucking charger, you work without orders, because the horses whisper their needs before the men even know them. One night there's thunder, not from the sky, but from hooves. A night falls, not yours. Another, thrown mid-charge during a drill. The horse stands wild-eyed, foam at the mouth. The other stable hands back away. You step forward. No rope, no whip. You raise your hands, speak low, let him smell you. You see the wound behind the ear, the blister from a tightened bridle. You reach slowly, touch gently. He bows his head, lets you lead him. The men stare but say nothing. Your name begins to carry, not loudly but persistently, like a hoof print in soft earth. The knight calls you into his tent one evening. You think it's about his horse. It isn't. He points to a scroll, tells you to read. You hesitate. He notices, then chuckles. No matter, most don't. He hands you a carving instead, a small wooden horse roughly whittled. From my son, he says. You nod. He waits a moment, then says, you remind me of him. You're not sure if that's good or bad, but he hands you a strip of dried meat. You take it. Chew slowly, silently, together. Battle does not come. Not yet. But it hangs, thick in the air, like the coppery taste of blood before it's shed. The knights train. The squires sharpen. The horses tense. You clean hooves. Men tack. Sleep with your boots on. You dream of stalls, of the mare who nuzzled your sleeve, of the old gelding who died with eyes open. You wonder where they are now. You wonder if they remember you. On the 10th night, a squire runs into camp, says a bridge collapsed near the river crossing. The knight's horse was caught in the current. You sprint before he finishes speaking. By the time you reach the edge, the horse is half submerged, one leg tangled in reeds. The knight is shouting. Others hold ropes. You don't shout. You wade in cold deep, thick with mud. You reach the horse. You see the fear in its eyes. You know it won't last long. You speak. Low, steady. Place your hand on its cheek. Cut the reeds. Guide it out. It limps. But it walks. The knight doesn't speak for a long time, then says, you're not just a stable boy. You shrug because that's all you know how to be. When the campaign ends, you don't return with them. The knight leaves you in a village stable, says, you belong here more than in battle, leaves you coin and the carved horse. You watch him, ride away, then turn to the stall where a young foal kicks the wall. You open the door, step inside, speak low. You are no one, but to the horses, you are everything. Years pass. No one knows your name in the village. They call you the Whisperer, so the quiet one, the boy from the barn. You build your own shelter, sleep near the foals, patch leather for farmers, feed the animals before yourself. Once, Lisette passes through the village. She doesn't recognize you, but her son climbs the fence to see the foals. You smile, because you know you have nothing and everything. One day a child asks you, were you ever a knight? You shake your head but pause and say, I once rode with one. The child nods, then asks, do horses remember things? You look toward the paddock. Watch the old mare lean against her post, eyes half-lidded, and you say, they remember everything that matters. Good night.